Okay, so welcome back, everyone. If you don't know me, my name is Dr. Amin Davoudi. I'm assistant professor of bilingual and ESL education at the University of Texas Permian Basin. Yazdan.
This is Yazdan Chibsaz. I'm a senior lecturer in English at Sultan Qaboos University here in Muscat, Oman.
And we're so excited to have our second keynote speech today. The title of this presentation is Openness in Technology Enhanced Language Learning. And we couldn't ask for a better title because it actually aligns really, really well with the mission of TELIC, which is to provide an opportunity for scholars from all around the world to participate in a high quality professional development top conference and learn from scholars in the field. So I'm going to read Dr. Hubbard's bio. Phil Hubbard is Senior Lecturer Emeritus at the Stanford University Language Center, where he served as Director of English for Foreign Students from 2003 to 2020. Working in computer-assisted language learning for the past 4 decades, he has published in the areas of evaluation, development, theory, research methodology, listening, teacher education, and learner training. He served on the team that developed the T-cell technology standards in 2008 and 2011, and is associate editor of the journals Computer Assisted Language Learning and Language Learning and Technology. His most recent book, An Invitation to Call: Foundations of Computer Assisted Language Learning 2021, is available for free download at www.apacall.org. I'm going to share that link in the chat box. Thank you so much, Phil, for your time. The floor is yours. Please go ahead and share your screen.
Okay, well, thank you very much, both Amin and Yazdan and your whole crew here. It's a pleasure to be addressing you all from California. Hello. And I did jump at the opportunity to do a talk on openness. I had recently been exploring this for another conference, and so it fit in very nicely. And also, as you'll see, with a lot of my own interests over the years. So let me go ahead and I'm going to share screen and hope that all works out. You'll have to tell me if you see what you expect to see.
Sure.
I'm going to share the entire screen. One thing I did not test before I started this is if I do an external link, I'm pretty sure if I'm sharing the entire screen that the pop-up will show what's on my browser, and then I can jump back easily. Always like to test that before, but here we go. Okay, so right now I'm sharing the screen, which should mostly be the same screen you're seeing, but I will now pop into my whoops. There we go.
Awesome.
All is well.
Okay. So, oops. All right. So first thing I want to mention is there's a QR code there for all of the slides. The slides have a lot of links that we won't have time to explore. I'll talk about them and maybe explore a couple of them, but mostly this is going to be something where you'll need to go back on your own. And I also have put the URL for this into the chat, if that's easier to get at. At the end of the talk, I'll have a slide up that has this information again, but I found it's always easiest just to grab my phone and take a picture of the screen, or go immediately to the QR reader and do that. So I'm going to explore this world of openness, and following the conference, I'm referring to this at times as technology enhanced language learning, but because I go back in my own field over 40 years now, it's computer assisted language learning in my brain. And if you'd ever like to know more about that, I have a paper I co-authored back in 2005 on why call. Okay, bit of background. So I got this invitation to give a keynote at a completely open international conference on TEL. And that was exciting because completely open. So what should I talk about? Well, I thought I'd talk about open and openness, the way those terms and the concepts are used in our field and have been throughout the 40 years or so of call and TEL. So we're going to begin many years ago when computer-assisted language learning was still a toddler. This is my version of Photoshop. Very crude version. Not only that, I didn't really like IBM back then. I was an Apple II person. Okay, so 1980s. In the beginning of our field, it was a time of teacher programmers or teachers who knew programmers. There were a few big projects, but a lot of the development of the field came from the bottom up through organizations like Calico, the Computer Assisted Language Learning intersection of TESOL, and what was originally called MUSLI, which was Microcomputer Users for English as a Second Language Instruction in IATEFL. And so these groups got together, they shared the programs they'd been working on, and I started programming exercises for my students in late 1982, just reading and vocabulary exercises on Apple II computers. There was some commercial software back then. It wasn't particularly good, and it was very expensive. I remember getting a free copy when I got a new computer of a program from IBM that was retailed at $40, and the goal of it was to teach 4 prepositions to native speaking children, like up, down, left, right, or something like that. Anyway, it was a lot of work for not very much, and something you could have easily demonstrated without technology. I first jumped into this open idea. I was already giving away my programs at TESOL conferences when I went there. But I started a public domain software clearinghouse for ESL, both to distribute my own programs, but also to distribute those of my colleagues. And jumping back a little bit, so public domain, we didn't have the Creative Commons licenses back then. That's a fairly new thing. So you could either hold copyright or you could make your work public domain, in which case you gave up all rights to it. So I gave up all rights to mine because I was constantly doing new stuff anyway. There was also what was called freeware, which is material that people gave away, but they maintained the copyright to, and that supposedly you weren't supposed to go in and tweak too much, although I'll get to that in a moment. And then shareware, where people would give away the full program, and then if you used it, you were expected to pay a fee back to the author. In a way, it's sort of the implied model that's used by, say, Wikipedia, where they look for donations from those who use it. Another use of open during this period was the difference between open versus closed courseware, and courseware was just software that was used for educational purposes. So open courseware meant that the teacher or the user could put new information into it and the program ran on it. Text reconstruction programs where you might put in a paragraph and then it would pull out every 7th word, and then the learner would try and reconstruct the missing words, or you'd have a scrambled sentence or something like that. Those are examples of open courseware. And of course, other kinds of open programs were word processors. Some other things from the 1980s, my late colleague Vance Stevens, all the way back in 1985, wrote a paper about using public domain software designed for other purposes and then adapting it to English as a second language teaching. And the key word there is adapt, because if you wanted to adapt the program, you actually had to go in and rewrite parts of the basic code. But the programs were all public domain, so you were legally able to do that if you had the skill. It's interesting that the journal he published this in, TESOL Reporter, is an open journal now, so you can actually find this article if you're interested. He also had his own sort of clearinghouse in that if you sent him a prepaid disk mailer, he would send you the disk back for your, this was all for Apple II computers, he would send you the disk back with all those programs loaded on it. So again, labor of love. A lot of this work eventually became part of the TESOL call intersection library. And that was something that was available all year, but was especially prominent at TESOL conferences, where people could come in and get free material, either by copying it themselves initially, and then later on, when that got too cumbersome, they would pay a fee for the disk, and we would copy it for free. Moving along in the history, the web opened a new age for us. And 1993 is a very important part of that because of the opening of two things. I believe that was the year that they opened, the developers opened up the HTTP, the hypertext transfer protocol, and allowed things to go back and forth over the web the way we still do now. In most modern sites, we've added an S to that HTTP for secure, but it's basically the same idea. It's moving things from one server to another, or from a server to a client computer, like the one you might be using right now. The other thing was it opened up the HTML programming language, hypertext markup language that's behind, or was behind certainly at that time, all of the web pages. So now anyone with a website could host, and you could set that up. I actually had a server in my office during this period for our language program. Eventually Stanford decided it was not secure, and so I had to give that up. But it really did open it up. And so what did we get? Now we've got free information. We've got free class materials. Teachers are beginning to, if they have access to a website, or if they know someone with a website, they can put their materials up on the web. You can download the documents themselves. That would be using the file transfer protocol, the FTP. You could download programs in the same way with FTP. And some teachers put up various kinds of practice and quizzes where students could go directly. One of my favorites, this is from a group that still exists, Charles and Larry Kelly, brothers in Japan, who own the site manythings.org, and they've developed all kinds of little programs to help their students in Japan with English. Just to give you an idea of what an interactive quiz was back in the 90s. This was from 97. Let me see if I can make this link work. Okay, I am going to hope that people can see this. So back then, if you wanted to do a quiz, you couldn't really do it the way we do now. You couldn't have answers pop up, but you could use a characteristic already built into HTML, which was the text box that scrolls. And so in this case, you've got scrambled words, and then the answer is below. So for example, tar, you try to get the answer, and then you check your answer, and it's rat. So it just goes down like that. So crude, but more interactive than just having, a list of here are the questions and a separate list of here are the answers. Okay, if things go well, when I close this, it will go back to my piece here. And I don't have an easy way of knowing unless one of the moderators interrupts me if somehow I have lost track. So be sure to tell me, because it would make me feel silly to just be talking here to nobody who's listening. Okay. A few years later, actually about 15 years later, we had something that became known as Web 2.0. And this opened the web to everybody in a great sense. So this is the participatory web. It includes things like blogs and wikis, Google Docs, other kinds of shared documents, social media of all sorts. In fact, what we're using right now, Microsoft Teams, is a very good example of that. Much of it was open in the sense of free access, and I'm going to be coming back to these other definitions of open, because open doesn't always mean free. So the next step was apps, mobile apps, other apps. We have apps we use on our desktop and laptop computers now. They're no longer called programs, even though that's what they are technically. They've borrowed that term apps, short for applications, from the mobile era. So let's shift gears and see, what about these notions of open and openness now? I'm going to go through a few areas here. I'm going to talk about it from the developer's perspective, from the perspective of teachers and learners, and from the perspective of researchers and consumers of research. Okay, so what does open mean for developers? There are probably some of you out there who do some development, and maybe some fairly serious ones. I used to do a lot of development. I haven't done very much in the last probably 25 years. So I'm less aware of what's available, but I know there's open source code available. I know there is support, especially this forum Stack Overflow, where if you're having problems with your coding, you can get answers. There are open distribution channels. So once you have something, you can distribute it. And then open tools for developers. Again, as a reminder, all of these links are, at least the last time I checked, they were all solid, and you'll be able to get them when you go back and try my slides online. So if there are other ones during the question period, if a developer wants to pop up and say, hey, I thought of something else, that would be fine. Okay, let's go to the more common areas. So teachers and learners, and I have several slides for this one. So we have open general resources, tools, applications. YouTube's a good example. And I already mentioned things like Wikipedia. You have open language learning content and tools. So things that are specifically oriented towards helping language learning. One of my favorites is a site called Youglish, which was developed for English. It stands for YouTube English, but it's now available in several other languages. And it takes, if you haven't seen it, it takes clips of YouTube videos, and then you type in a word and it finds that word in context in a whole series of YouTube videos, and you get to listen to what it sounds like as it's spoken in context. It was originally designed to support pronunciation, but it can actually be used in a number of interesting ways. And then we now have open technology standards. So as was mentioned, Amin mentioned in my introduction, I was part of the team that developed the TESOL technology standards, which the framework document came out in 2008. And I'm continuing to work on standards now for a group in Canada. And we're finding that a lot of what was written for the TESOL standards is still quite relevant today. So it's a good place to go if you don't know of other resources that are relevant for you for standards for what teachers should know and what learners should know. On June 5th, 2023, TESOL did something I've rarely seen them, something they used to charge for, open. And not only open, they gave it a CC share-alike license. So you can not only take that, it's about a 51, I think, page document, the framework document for the TESOL standards. I've put it up on my own web now because I can, because the license lets you. But you can also go in and you can take the standards, you can pull half of them out and use those, you can add to them, you can change the wording, you can translate. All you need to do is make sure you don't charge for that. It's got to be non-commercial, and whatever you produce, you also have to share. So that's what, if you're not familiar, this is very relevant for the open stuff, in the sense of making it freely available. Take a look at the CC licenses and the various ways in which you can make your material, or the way other people have made their material, available for using. And you can see the $ is scratched out there to show that it's got to be for non-commercial use. But this is still a very big thing for TESOL to do, because one of the things that hampered the distribution of the standards was that TESOL was charging for them. Okay, another one. You've probably heard of MOOCs. You may have even tried them out. Some of you may have even, helped develop one. So massive online open courses are MOOCs, and LMOOCs are ones specifically for language, massive open online courses. I do want to say open here does not mean free. There are free ones, but open just means you don't have to apply the way you would for a university. You don't have to send in an application. Anyone who wants to take the course, if it's a course for a fee, anyone who pays the fee can take it. And if it's for free, of course, anyone can take it. You might be discouraged if you don't have enough background for it. So I gave just a couple of examples here. These are free courses. This is a French course on a platform called Coursera, which is very commonly used for these. And then just a very interesting one, an English for Specific Purposes course for massage therapists. And it basically teaches massage therapists who often, at least in the US, are not native speakers of English. It teaches them the names of muscles and bones and so on that are relevant for their job. You can have open language exchanges. There's one called Mixer, which is at a particular university, and I forget which one right now. I'm a little embarrassed. I don't remember, but it's university-based. And then mylanguageexchange.com, a more commercial one, but both free. And the goal is to put, a speaker of one language, let's say an English speaker learning French, together with a French speaker who wants to practice English. And so that's the way you do the language exchanges. They have some support in the way of materials or suggested tasks, but basically it's on you as the exchanger. At the class level, there are all various virtual exchanges, and the one that I think is now best known because it not only is good for putting groups together, but it also has a solid research base. Supported by the European Union. It's a group called Unicollaboration. And in addition to going there and trying to figure out how you can find a class to match yours for language exchanges, it also has a dedicated journal with which is an open journal, of course, and that's good. And then for those who are interested, there are still various free tutorial apps. Duolingo is probably the best known, at least in the US. And we'll talk a little bit later about, what does free mean in this kind of context? Because you as a user are giving something back in exchange for this, even if you're not aware of it. There's a big area of open educational resources. And these are, some people use this in a loose sense to mean anything that's educational that's made available to others for free. The tighter definition, which oercommons.org has, includes things like you have to make it so that other people can adapt it. So if you donate an open educational resource, it has to fit into a particular kind of format and with permissions that allow others to not only reuse it, but also to adapt it. Another University of Texas campus, besides the Permian Basin one that is hosting this conference, has the Center for Online Education Resources in Language Learning. And they have a community network. I was just checking that before the talk, which is why it's in a different color. This shows, let me go ahead and pop this one open. It's kind of nice. It gives a list of people who have actively promoted foreign language OER by sharing and modeling. So if you're interested, including those who hosted this conference, you can take a look at this and see if you qualify as an ambassador by going to that link. And then they have all kinds of badges, people who review for other online or open educational resources. There are ones for being a general creator and a master creator, and so on. And ones for teachers, so those of you who like to collect badges, or ideally whose institution would actually recognize this as a contribution, are encouraged to take a look at things like that. I should also mention that they have a free book. Naturally, since it's about open education, the book itself is open. So if you want to, you have to pay if you want a hard copy, but you can download the ebook for free. There are other areas. For many years now, since 2004, the organization Calico, Computer Assisted Language Instruction Consortium, has had a yearly award for access to education. So materials that are online and open, and they're rated, as you see, on various factors. In 2022, the winner was called Multi Olelo from University of Hawaii. And you can explore that if you want. Another organization, the International Association for Language Learning Technologies, has an open journal, Foreign Language Technologies magazine. Unlike a lot of the journals, this one is more practice focused. I found it very interesting that one of the articles they had recently was a crowdsourced article. So instead of having a single or predetermined group of authors, they invited everybody who wanted to submit to this article on AI, which is obviously on a lot of people's minds now. And here's another more normal article on using Quizlet. Okay, let me shift to researchers. So one area that's important for researchers that's becoming more prominent is open data. So this can be used for developers and teachers too, but it's especially important for researchers to be able to make their data open if their protocol allows that, but also being able to get at data. There's a good article here by Josef Kulpert on this. And Language Learning and Technology had a special issue on big data. You also have open tools. So again, for developers and teachers too. Prot is one that's was developed primarily for doing phonetic and phonological research, but it turns out it's very good at helping do visualizations, for example, to support pronunciation. And then Tom Cobb's Complete Lexical Tutor, which is in English, and I believe there's a French version too. That one is fantastic. I use it a lot for doing vocabulary profiling. So you can put a text in and it will tell you what percentage of the words and which words are at the 1,000 word level and 2,000 and 3,000 and 4,000 using both the British National Corpus and the US Corpus of Contemporary American English. So very valuable rather than just using your intuition about how common a word is. Back in 2002, I did a survey of unanswered questions in call, many of which remain unanswered, and the piece is still up there if you want. This was in response to a request from the journal Computer Assisted Language Learning, which was hosting a conference in Antwerp for researchers. And at a time when I didn't consider myself a researcher, but more of a developer and methodologist, and they wanted me to give a plenary talk on something to do with research. So I decided the best thing to do was ask everybody else what they wanted. So I kind of crowdsourced my plenary by asking over 100 colleagues around the world what was one question they thought was important to answer that they didn't have time to do research on themselves. And I got over 60 responses, and this website has the information of the description of the question, and in many cases, the background of why the question's important, and even suggested methodology for how to go about doing the research. All but 8 of the 64 respondents agreed to be identified. So often when you see a survey, all you see is the results. But in this case, it's all the raw data. It's all the responses and identified by the experts who provided it, except for 8 of them who chose to remain anonymous. I expected about half to remain anonymous, so I was very happy to see that. Of course, we have open conferences. So I have a link there. You don't really need the link to this conference since you're here right now. This is there are open conferences in the sense that I've been familiar with, in the sense of open to anyone who wants to be involved. Often they still do have fees for online ones. So I'm again very supportive of what this group is doing here in putting this conference together. As an aside, I just got a request to submit an abstract to a conference which will remain unnamed, but the conference fee for a 3-day conference was going to be 600 euros. So this is much cheaper. Okay, other areas of open. So researchers want to get their material out. They want to be in a journal that's highly regarded. In fact, their institutions may demand that it's at a particular level of international recognition, and of course that it's peer reviewed. Here are some examples of open access journals, at least for now. So the Language Learning and Technology has been open access from its beginnings in 1997. It was always online. It is recognized as one of the leading journals in the field. And importantly, compared to many others, pretty much all the commercial journals, it lets the authors maintain the full copyright. And so that's a big thing if you ever want to do something with your own work. Call Electronic Journal has been around quite some time. It is, I think, a little more of a mix of research and practice. Eurocall Review Eurocall has two journals. They have Recall, which is published by Cambridge and is free for members, but otherwise you need to get it through libraries or pay a fairly substantial fee as an outsider to get it. But Eurocall Review, published in Valencia, is open. And most recently, the organization ChinaCall has worked with De Gruyter, a very well-known publisher, but come up with an open journal. They have the financing apparently to be able to make all the articles in the journal open. There are also open access papers. So this is obviously in the open journals, they're all free, but there are also open access papers in paid journals. Sometimes it's for a short period. Often, for example, if a journal, I know this is true of Calico, if an article is chosen as article of the year, then it's made available for a month or something. And then there are some other ones. I have an article from Calico that was made Creative Commons so that it could be distributed through teacher training programs at the US State Department because they demand only open materials. Okay, I've talked about open mostly in this idea of freely available, but there are a number of other interesting uses of open, and some of them have nothing to do with what you might think. More along the lines of that open courseware that I talked about in the 1980s, where you could put material in, but you still had to buy the program that you were putting the material into. There is a very important article in the history of our field, which is titled something like Call Past, Present, and Future by the late Stephen Bax. And it's the article that brought in the concept of normalization, which some of you may know. Anyway, he distinguished three stages for call. Restricted, which was like the 1980s and 1990s. Open, which brings us more into this idea of computer-mediated communication, simulations, games. He was just a couple of years too early to get into, I think, the Web 2.0 stuff, certainly well before social media became prominent. But that would be open. And then integrated, where the technology is essentially so much a part of the language learning and so much a part of our everyday practice. That's the notion of normalization, where we don't really think about the technology much anymore because it's just what we do. His claim was that we were in the open period, but we hadn't really worked all our way through it, and that we were still well short of integrated call. Another use of open is open to ideas. Open to ideas from other fields. So I did a paper a few years ago with Josef Kolpert on transdisciplinarity, or also interdisciplinarity. So bringing in concepts from fields outside, particularly outside of second language learning. And then a good example of that, by the way, is when people started doing a lot with gaming, and they brought in theories like Csikszentmihalyi's theory of flow, and how being in a flow state was not only what gamers wanted to be in, but it was really good for language learning, where you're just so involved that you don't even realize that you're using the language and you're doing things proficiently. Another concept, theory ensembles, which Mike Levy and I came up with in a 2016 paper, is the idea of individual theories from different areas coming together for a particular research or development project, but maintaining their individuality. Whereas in transdisciplinarity, you really synthesize those into an organic whole. Of course, we have open AI now. So ChatGPT and its friends. I won't say anything more about that because that is quite well known now. And I'm sure there are some talks at this conference about it. But there are still other uses. So we have open with respect to accessibility. Before I put my slides online, I ran them through an accessibility subroutine that's built into Microsoft PowerPoint, so that anytime I had a graphic, for example, I had to have a text description of that graphic. I used to think that was a lot of extra work, but it's become, in some ways, automated. You can actually click and ask it to generate one, but in my experience, it's pretty bad at generating the alt text for most graphics. But you can do it in 5 minutes. You can, do most, unless you're very heavy graphic on your slide, you can get it done, and then it's accessible to someone who can't see. Calico has recently developed a subcommittee for equity, diversity, access, and conclusion, and did a survey for an open and global discussion of social justice. And I think this is going to feature prominently in the next Calico conference. I'm hoping this group is also going to present at World Call in Thailand. If you don't know about that, that's sort of, I always thought of it as the Olympics of Call. It's a conference that's only offered every 5 years. And it will be in November. And if you don't know about it and might be interested, especially if you're, in Asia and closer to Thailand to get to it, just put in World Call, all one word, 2023, and you should be able to find the information. Abstracts, second round of abstracts are still open into August. Finally, and this is a big one for me, there's open in the sense of opening up the past. So if you don't know about the Internet Archive, it's something you should really explore. What they have done since the late 1990s, I think, is they have gone around the web selectively and picked up copies of web pages that then disappear or are changed. So before TESOL released the technology standards, they had previously had it available on their own website, so you could download it. I was able to find it on the web archive and show it to my students. Just if you're curious, here's an example of what the web archive has. I'm going to need to pop that open quite a bit. So this is my computer-assisted language learning course from 2001, last updated February 2001. I have long since lost all this material, but it's in the Internet Archive. And so if you wanted to see what an introduction to computer-assisted language learning looked like back then, this is, I still have my call course online. This is essentially what was in that, the most updated version of it is in that free book that was mentioned in the introduction. But if you're historically interested in seeing what used to be call, this is just one example. I've also used it when I had material that I really liked that had disappeared. And I was able to find it from an earlier version. Okay, I see I'm down to about the last 5 minutes, so let me move on. I want to conclude by talking a bit about challenges. So open in the sense of free and freely available. What does that mean? Who pays for the development and the maintenance? So this is that Center for Online English, Educational Resources for Language Learning. And what you'll see is here's a big donate page. They get funding from the federal government. I don't know what other sources they might have, foundations or something, but a lot of it's from the federal government. It's not enough. If you use these things, you can donate. Open journals. Talked about language learning and technology. They've got to make a gift here. Somebody has to pay for all the final. There's actually, by the way, there's only one paid position for this journal, and that's the managing editor, who's a graduate student who makes sure everything works smoothly. The editors, the associate editors, the reviewers, even the people who do the copy editing, all volunteers. So it still costs money. It's hosted by the Hawaii Foundation and one of the language centers there in Hawaii, and I think another one maybe at Michigan State. But they can use money. Open training. So here are a couple of examples of training programs. One of them is actually called Open for Online Professional English Network. That's funded by the U.S. State Department. Center for Applied Linguistics, also funded by the U.S. government. So basically, these are funded by U.S. taxpayers. Or more realistically, because we always run a deficit, my grandchildren and their grandchildren will be funding these. Open publishing. So there's the pay to publish, what's often called the gold standard. So computer-assisted language learning, Recall, and the Calico Journal, those 3 of the 4 big journals, language learning and technology, not having any fee. You have to pay to publish. By the way, Calico is open access after 3 years. The other 2 are closed forever. Publication fees range from $1,600 to $3,500. That's a lot to come up with if you don't have a very healthy grant and you want your material to be open. There are also pay-to-play predatory journals, which promise to get your material out in a week or 2, and they do a poor job of reviewing. They mostly take your money. They do publish, and then they get you on various citation indices, but not the big ones. And there's a list here which was normally shared between editors about these journals. Some other concerns with free: you're giving up your personal data, of course. You're giving up time and your students' time if you're using ad-supported YouTube. The quality is an issue. Free is not always as good as paid, often isn't. Quantity, there are many limitations of free. We have this freemium model. So if I want to use Zoom for more than 40 minutes, for example, I have to use I have an institutional version, which is great, but a lot of people don't. Now I'm going to turn it back on you. How much are you a producer as well as a consumer of open resources? If you're presenting here, you're a producer. You're making your research available for free to a world audience. But you should think about your plans. So I'm going to close with just a few considerations, because it's not obvious. You can say, well, ideally, everything should be free. But again, I've told you about the costs there. There are a few of you out there who maybe do already or would teach for free, but most people can't because it's how they make their living. And expecting other people's labor to always be free to you is just not realistic if you're not part of the contribution as well. So when it's easy to make your work open, in conference proceedings, putting up slideshows, etc., do it. If it's not, you can make a rough cost-benefit analysis. What will you lose by giving your material up? Will you lose time? Will you lose future rights? I've had people say they can't publish in conference proceedings because then they won't be able to publish in a real journal. None of the journals I work with would say that's true. If you have a shorter version of a paper in a conference proceeding, it's more than welcome in a journal, but it may not be true of all journals. And then what do you gain? So you gain satisfaction. You feel good when you give stuff away. You gain publicity, and so on. You need to understand ownership. At Stanford, everything I produce, I can distribute unless they have paid me specifically on a separate grant to distribute it. But that's not true of every institution. It's not true of a lot of institutions. I put up all my class notes. Other people might not be able to do that. So who owns this? And then try to avoid hoarding. One of the things that always bugged me was somebody would have something good that they could share, and they would say, well, I'm saving this for X, and X never comes along. And because of that, they end up not being able to share it because technology changes and it's obsolete. And then beware of risks for opening up your work. And also understand that openness is just one form of service to the profession. You're contributing if you're a reviewer for a journal, for example, or if you help people in setting up a conference and so on. Okay, so the conclusion, and again, there's the QR code if you're interested in the notes. Open and openness can have many interpretations. Open can occur by design with support. So the European Commission put together this great set of materials for called teacher education back in the early 2000s. Might have even gone all the way back to the late 1990s, called ICT for LT. It can also occur spontaneously through goodwill, yours or others. And what about open call and tell? I think in 40 years, we've gotten a whole lot closer to the target of people being able to have enough material that they don't have to worry about if they don't have funds for textbooks and so on, that they can still find good stuff to fill in. So thank you. And that's it. I'm going to leave that up for just a moment. And then I will, actually, I will go ahead and pop over and stop sharing, I think, here. Okay.
Thank you so much, Phil, for this great presentation.
So this is the online version, by the way, if you want to see it. So this is now up on the web, the one you see here. And that way I can get rid of the PowerPoint. And go back here. And there I am. Okay.
Awesome. So Yazdan, do you want to go ahead and ask the first question?
Yes, Phil, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us. I'm not sure if this is a question, but I'm gonna go ahead and read that. This is from Josh. I appreciate that you say that we can't expect access to others' free labor. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has radically changed how we relate to work and labor, which makes this even more important. So how can institutions better support and value labor that leads to open resources and not to outputs that can be monetized?
That's a very good question. And the problem is what kind of institutions? There are, in the US, certainly, there are lots of private institutions. My university is a private institution, but it's not a for-profit institution. So they have always, if I develop something that's patentable, they want a piece of it. But if it's just copyrightable, they seem to be fine with that. They like that their brand is being distributed in a sense. So the monetizing makes me a little uncomfortable, even though I know exactly where that's coming from, because there are other values that come out of this, including the value of providing resources. There are groups, I was supported by my institution at that time. It was Ohio University back in the 80s to do this public domain software distribution library because they thought it was good for them and might attract more students. So that wasn't monetization at all. It's free advertising in a sense. So there's that. I think organizations that try to maintain too tight a control of something that their teachers developed, and often something their teachers developed that they didn't have to. They could have just stuck with the textbook and, not been creative and not done something that's very short-sighted. Yeah, I can't take it too much further than that. I have been very lucky in that I've been able to do things. I've talked about how wonderful I've done with open things over the years. I also have all of my course notes are still online and open to the world. Anybody who can, get in onto the World Wide Web is welcome to my course notes. But I've gone through publishers and come up with very expensive books that a lot of people don't have access to. What I've done in that case, and maybe this is something that you can think about too, whoever asked the question there, when I was publishing a book that I didn't control the rights to, I made a book support website. So an example of this is I have a 4-volume set from Routledge on computer-assisted language learning. It's all reprinted articles. I think 78 of them or something that were sort of the core articles of the field up until 2009 when this was published. I came up with a website, put in the table of contents, and for every article that was freely available on the web, like all the language learning and technology ones, I put in a link. So it's being a little bit subversive, but it's also not getting in the way of the copyrights. So I'm only doing it with parts of that. So that's and the other thing is the full table of contents is there. So if people are just interested in finding them, and their libraries do have these articles that appeared either in books or journals, then they can go and do that. So I guess I'm saying, try and be a little bit creative and see what you can come up with. How can institutions better support? That's the question. Is I'm not an institution. I'm a person, and all I can do is say, what if you have any administrative clout, then try to work in this direction and explore things like the Center for Online or Center for Open Educational Resources and so on. See what you can get there if it is something that you can do.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your response.
Yeah.
I think, yes, we only have 2 minutes, but let's just thank Phil again for his contribution to the field. I think all of us have enjoyed reading your work over the years. And Yazan, do you want to go ahead and also share what you mentioned in the chat box about recall?
I think, Phil, with my limited knowledge, I was actually checking the homepage's recall as well. So I think as of this August or early January, recall would also be open access, if I'm not wrong.
I believe so, but I think there's still there's a publishing fee involved now that the authors have to pay or their institutions have to pay. So there's you take a look at that, but a lot of the open access journals now are these what we call pay to play. And if you're in the biological sciences and you've got $1 million grant, it's no big deal. But if you're in the humanities and education, coming up with those funds is tough. And to be fair, a lot of the journals they'll have tiered levels for that. But I would take a look at that and see, because unless somebody is donating a lot of money to Cambridge, I don't think it's fully open. But maybe they've decided it's in their best interest to do that. Because
Phil,
commercial publishers
I'm
are
reading from the homepage. We are delighted to announce that all articles accepted for publication and recall from the 4th of August will be open access, published with a Creative Commons license and freely available to read online. I think this also refers to the CC that you were unpacking in the middle of your
right.
talk.
But again, what if you look at the author submission information, see if it says whether there is a fee involved. They have some three-letter acronym for basically dealing with that, and I honestly don't know. That would be great if I'm on the editorial board, so if it would make me happy to see that that stuff. I have an old article. I presume they're not making this retroactive, so the older articles will still be a fee based.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much, Phil, for the great keynote speech. We really appreciate your time.